George, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure indeed.
Would you please tell us a little bit about your organization?
Happily. The organization was started in 1935 by my dad, and actually his experience goes back to the 20s. Did some interviewing on for his PhD doctorate in the University of Iowa on the readership of advertising. And then he did some polling for my grandmother, who ran as Secretary of State in Iowa in 1932. She ran as a woman and as a Democrat, and incredibly, she won. I mean, the odds were really against her in Iowa in those days. But my dad did a poll on her race, and the results were only 1 percentage point off what she actually got. And he had a keen interest in journalism too, and he was the head of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, and so all these forces came together, if you will, and resulted in his starting the Gallup poll in 1935, feeling that it would be a wonderful dimension to journalism and a new kind of history, if you will, a history of what people think as well as what they do. We've grown over the years rapidly, and we now exist in 60 nations of the world, most recently China, so we're very excited about that. And also, of course, we've had an affiliate in Japan for many, many years. And we're able to cover 90% of the surveyable world now, at the present time. And the day of instant global surveys is not that far off.
How has polling changed over the years?
Well, it certainly expanded around the world. That's one of the ways. New technology has helped us analyze the data more quickly, but not an awful lot's happened in sampling. We've really gone about as far as we can go in terms of developing sampling frames. Interviewing techniques have changed to some degree. We do a lot more work by telephone surveys than we do in person. In the beginning, surveys were all in person, and now they're by telephone. So that's been a major change, actually. And there have been new questionnaire techniques developed, but really not much has changed a lot scientifically in the last few decades. But the spread of polling and the way the information is processed has certainly changed a lot.
Can you tell us about the 1948 presidential race, when President Truman was actually down by, I think, 5 points, and then he ended up winning? Were you involved at that point, and what happened during that election cycle?
We all came a cropper that year. All the major polls were off the mark, basically because they'd stopped polling too soon. It wasn't a failure of the method, really. It was basically just that we didn't catch the last-minute shift of support to Truman. And typically, when you have a third and fourth party candidates, that support collapses in the closing days of a campaign. With that vote going back to the major party candidates, that's exactly what happened in 1948. But we stopped a few weeks too early, didn't catch that drop in support, and we're off the mark indeed. I mean, there were other reasons, but they were more minor, allocation of the other side and so forth. So we didn't have to do a wholesale revision of our methods. We did move over a period of years from the quota sampling, which is telling interviewers to go out and get XX% of people in various occupation groups, XX men and women and so forth, leaving the choice in the hands of the interviewer. We did move from that to setting up ahead of time the places to which they are to go and the people to whom they're to interview.
One of the chief complaints that Americans sometimes have is that they are never called, never polled. For instance, I have an answering machine. What do you do in the case of so many Americans who have answering machines?
Well, in some cases they do, in some cases they don't. Some cases that say, I'll be calling back shortly, and so forth. Interviewing is so important, and we pride ourselves on having a very good interviewing staff. I mean, out of every 100 people who apply to be an interviewer, we take only 16. We put them through very careful tests, which means that I think we have one of the best response rates in the world, or at least in this country, and we keep these people on. They stay on, because it's really sort of a sixth sense to be a good interviewer.
How have the views of most Americans changed and maybe stayed the same over the years?
Well, they, in some ways, have been remarkably the same. I mean, we still have a high level of religious involvement and religious belief in this country. That hasn't really changed much over the last, now, 62 years. In other ways, there have been dramatic changes, actually. The sexual revolution has really changed attitudes enormously. The cost of living and concern over that has grown, certainly. Lifestyles have changed enormously. But in some ways it's been remarkably the same. As I mentioned, the percentage of people who would call themselves liberals or conservatives has really basically stayed the same. And the best way to judge that is to look at how people divide on certain issues that usually divide liberals and conservatives: gun control, prayer in schools, abortion, and so forth. Attitudes really over the last 30 years have not changed much on those particular issues. So really the split has been, almost 50-50. I mean, it's slightly more to the conservative side in recent years. But I think commentators tend to exaggerate that. They see a particular candidate winning and say, oh, the country's going this way. It's not necessarily the case.
How has the political life and the political structure changed over those years, and the attitudes towards it?
Well, attitudes have become more negative than before. I mean, and that's reflected in the vote. And in fact, I don't think they're really changed until a lot of the long-sought electoral reforms are brought about in this country. Tighter limits on campaign spending, maybe putting limits on the terms of office of candidates, shortening the campaign, and on and on and on. The public would really completely revamp the electoral process. And I think their discouragement with the electoral process is reflected in the declining number of people who vote in elections. It doesn't mean that necessarily they're apathetic, because we see Americans volunteering as much as ever, just about.
Is there a disconnect between the sort of the elite in society, the thinkers, the writers, the politicians, and so forth, and the average American?
Yeah, I would say there is to a considerable extent. I mean, the average person's stock of knowledge is not too good, too impressive, but the common sense quotient is high. To quote somebody, this is somebody else made that observation, but we would certainly underscore it from our surveys, that people are appallingly ignorant in terms of the Bible, for example, in terms of geography and science, and in terms of current events and so forth. They're really, just amazing areas of ignorance. And yet, the common sense of the public comes through again and again. Well, for example, the public is usually far ahead of their legislative leaders in support for certain programs. To say it's really quite pronounced, really. I mean, the average person really is not too aware of basic facts in certain areas, I mean, geography and science and certainly the Bible. But so there is that gap, indeed. But we have found over the years that the common sense quotient of the American people is extremely high. And I think one evidence of that is looking at their being ahead of their elected leaders in many different areas. We've seen that over the years.
You study the present views of the public, but you also study the future. What do you see? What trends do you see developing in the views of Americans in the future?
Well, my short-term outlook is quite bleak. I mean, we have some very severe trends in this country, very worrisome. Alcohol abuse. A fifth of all people say drinking is a problem in their homes. The divorce rate is exceedingly high in this country. 6 in 10 new marriages will break up, spreading dysfunction throughout society. We see child abuse and sexual abuse very, very high in this country, much higher, we find, in surveys than generally reported. And so, in violence is in certain areas is very, very bad. And with the coming younger population of younger teens and preteens, the situation is going to get a lot worse, too, in immediate years ahead. Having said that, I should readily say that most families are happy, are satisfied with their family life in this country. Most feel that they have control over their lives. Most say that their health is good, if not excellent. So, I mean, there are many, many positive things, and Americans are not despondent by any means. They may be apprehensive, but they're not despondent. So what it means is that we have a lot to protect, but there are an awful lot of threats, particularly facing young people today.
Most of us see America via television, radio, movies, films, magazines, so forth. How different is America from what we perceive it to be, or how different are Americans from what we see in the media?
I think a lot different, really. And the public feels, too, when we ask them, they feel that television and Hollywood distort the picture of America and make it seem much more violent than it actually is. And the concentration on negative events, which I guess to some degree is inevitable because it's more newsy, it distorts the picture too, I think.
Can you talk a bit about your life and your father and how the companies are configured today?
Well, I've spent 46 years with the Gallup poll. At one point I wanted to be a minister in a black church in Texas, and decided that this field is a form of ministry, to try to find out how people respond to God to the extent we can. And but I was very involved in the day-to-day activities of the Gallup poll for 3 or 4 decades, and wrote the reports and worked on the questionnaires and so forth. And it was great fun. I loved it, and still am involved, but on a periphery basis. My real passion, though, is digging beneath the surface of life and looking at underlying values, spirituality, the levels of religious belief, and so forth. And so I think the discoveries ahead are going to be in the inner life. I think that's the new frontier of survey research, will be the inner life.
What do you mean by the inner life?
Well, looking at religious experiences, looking at the power of prayer, looking at the quality of saintliness, that sort of thing. This century was devoted really to looking at exploring outer space, and I think the next century will be exploring inner space. I think the new discoveries will be in that area, really. So that excites me very much. And that's a little bit about what we were talking about today, as a matter of fact.
Can you talk about some of the books you've written, especially your most recent book?
Well, the most recent book was Scared Growing Up in America, published by Morehouse, and that was an attempt to put down data from youth themselves on the various risks that they face, and then we went to 15 experts in the area of alcohol abuse, suicide, eating habits, values, and so forth, and had them respond to this information on risks, and then advise the parents on steps that might be taken to help young people avoid these risks. So we attempted to write a very user-friendly book that could be picked up by people who don't read a great deal or a lot of books, and to make very practical information. Much of it is in the form of reminders in each of these areas. We covered 7 areas: suicide, smoking, eating, drinking, values, and so forth. And in this book we have a list of resources and hotlines, and we also have a quiz to see how good people are as parents. So that's the very latest book. The one before that was called The Saints Among Us, and we were endeavoring to put calipers on persons with a deep spiritual commitment to see how they differ from the rest of the population.
How do they differ?
Well, if they fall on one side of the scale on all 12 items that we were using in this test, we find that they are far more charitable than persons with less religious commitment. They are more ethical, they're more tolerant, despite the prevailing wisdom that the deeper you go into your faith, the more bigoted or closed-minded you become. The situation is just the opposite. This survey shows these people are more giving, they're more forgiving, they're more concerned about the betterment of society and having strong families. And I'm sure that we focused on Christians because most people in this country would call themselves Christians, but I'm sure it would cut across all faiths, and particularly and apply to deep faith. Well, one of the interesting things for me was that I was reminded of people in this little church I worked in Galveston, Texas, these older black women who were selfless, and yet they had joy in their life. They might not have been totally happy, but they had joy, a sense, of accomplishment, hope for the future, and deep faith in God. And so I sort of saw them in this book, really, because that was the prototype of a saint, would be an older black woman.
In your polling, what has surprised you the most?
Well, one, I'm always surprised at the levels of ignorance, really. I mean, there are 24 million Americans that can't locate the United States on a map of the world. And, you know, there are many young people that have no idea when the Civil War was fought. I mean, it's just, some of the results are appalling. So I've never failed to be appalled, frankly, sometimes, at the lack of knowledge in certain areas. But I never fail to be impressed, really, with what I think is the rightness of a lot of the decisions. I mean, when people really think about an issue, and we've tested this, and that when you give people the same amount of information, regardless of the level of formal education, they tend to zero in on the same response. So that gives me encouragement. That when people have all the information, they make good decisions.
On the political culture of the United States, you say it hasn't shifted much over the years. Has it gone up and down and then back where it was at, or has it generally been consistent, as you described it?
I think basically, talking about the last 3 decades or more, that the balance of liberal conservatives has not really changed that much. Somewhat, and it's been moving a little bit toward the conservative side, but not to the extent that people believe it is. And the way to judge that, I think, is looking at how people vote on issues that typically divide liberals and conservatives.
You also do polls looking back historically on which presidents are the most popular in the century. Which would be the most popular of our century?
Oh yes, we've carried popularity measurements since the late 30s, and that's probably the question we ask most often. So we have masses of information on that. Every week or two we're polling on the president's popularity. And overall, the average most popular presidents were, during the time, FDR had a high rating, LBJ, in the 3 years he was in office, and but there were the all-time low points came with Truman at one point, and with Nixon at one point, and LBJ just before he decided to bow out of the race in 1968, I believe it was.
Historically, looking back, do you do polls today of which presidents do you most admire?
Yeah.
Who comes out where on that?
Kennedy would come out ahead on that poll, and FDR comes out pretty well, but Kennedy wins those contests.
Is that due to the circumstances of his death, or was he popular at the time as well?
He was quite popular at the time, but the circumstances of his death, I'm sure, have sustained that high level of popularity.
When do you begin to poll for the next presidential campaign?
We'll be starting, actually, probably very soon now. I think next January we'll start to develop what we call trial heats, which we invented.
This is 3 years ahead of the election, roughly.
We may do an occasional survey at that point. Then we'll start much more in earnest 2 years before, and so test elections, trial heats, and so forth. It never ends.
And how do you see the race in 2000 for the presidency shaping up?
Well, certainly one of the most popular candidates of all is Colin Powell, and I don't know if there'll be tremendous pressure on him to run. And of course, there's a lot of talk about Al Gore too, Vice President Al Gore. So at this point, it looks as if they might be in the race, but we haven't done any polling on it yet, so I'm just guessing.
Now, you talked a bit earlier about the Gallup organization and the Gallup polling company. Can you tell us about that differentiation?
The Gallup polls are within the Gallup organization now.
I see.
The third organization is the Gallup Institute, which is a nonprofit, a public charity, and the purpose of that is to take survey information in the area of the environment, health, education, religion, and values, and take it the next step, to use that information to promote positive change in society, make sure the information gets to the people who can make a difference with it.
You're in a position to not only poll the views of Americans, but also to influence it. How do you balance those two responsibilities?
We feel that we're reporters, and that our job is just as accurate as we possibly can is to present information, and it's really out of our bailiwick once we've reported it, really. We don't know. We hope that it informs the public. We hope it energizes them in a positive way and elevate society. We hope for all of those things. And we make a point through the Institute to get the information to those people and groups that can bring about positive change. But it really, we can't do anything about how people, what they do with the information. But I think everything else being considered, it's better if people have the information than they don't have.
The name George Gallup is probably one of the best known names in the U.S. What was it like growing up as George Gallup Jr.?
Well, when I was a youngster, I didn't really, I didn't really think much about it. And it's as I get older, in a funny way, that I realize that in a funny way it is, it's sort of fun in a way, I guess, to be identified. But by the same token, it's sort of a burden too. I mean, subconsciously, I think I was always trying to be my father. And I realized that, we're all given different gifts from God, and you go with, soar with your strengths, whatever they are, and don't worry about the things you can't do well.
Will any of your children be taking over the company someday?
I have one. My son is working in religion research with me, so I don't know where that's going to head, actually.
Is he a George Gallup Jr. as well?
Well, he's the fourth.
Fourth.
There are a whole bunch of us, yeah. My grandfather was George H. Gallup.
You do a lot of speaking these days. In fact,
Yeah.
you're speaking at a conference today, this week. Talk a bit about that and what that's about.
Well, this is on spirituality and health, looking at the relationship of spirituality to physical healings, and emotional and psychological as well, and a tremendously fast-growing amount of evidence to indicate that there is the faith factor is very powerful in healing and in recovery from illnesses and so forth. I think that's one of the things that society is very slow in coming to a recognition, at least the elites, if you will, that the faith factor is probably the most powerful dynamic in American life. It has much more to do with who we are and what we say in society than does politics or education or where we live, really. The intensity of our religious faith really is a very decisive factor in so much in our life. People who have a deep faith are less prone to crime, criminal activity. They're happier, they have less stress, they're not as depressed as often, they do better in school, they're more hopeful about the future, they have healthier lives, and they have longer lives. So what was said in Proverbs is true today, really, that God is good.
How is polling in Japan? Have you kept up with that at all?
Yes, it's taken hold in a tremendous way, and it did very early on. The Japanese are very good in polling techniques, and so it's very widespread in the country.
Tell us a bit about your life back in New Jersey.
Well, let's see, my interest in that sort of thing. Well, I play a very bad trumpet, which I play a lot, just hacking around. I've done a lot of singing in Gilbert and Sullivan for various companies. I sing bass baritone roles, sung with the Philadelphia Savoy Company and so forth. I like to play tennis. I love soccer when I was younger. I was a coach and a player. And let's see what else. I live on a farm and get a great charge out of that.
Do you have any goals or projects for the future?
Yes, the ones that excite me most, I guess rather predictably, are those that exploring the inner life. And we are doing a study right now on persons who are dying and how their beliefs about what happens after death give them solace or don't give them solace, and how caregivers can, with this information, pray with people and help them in these final days. So I'm very excited about that prospect. Another area we want to explore in great depth is the whole area of physical healing. What is it doing in people's lives? What is the need for it that people see, and are the clergy responding to this too?
How does a view of afterlife affect people who are dying?
Well, we haven't done the survey.
Oh, that's coming.
It's coming, yeah. And we're developing the scale to measure how people's love of God relates to love of man, the vertical and horizontal. And I'm excited about that. We're still in the rudimentary stage of that.
In what ways do you think polling in general will change in the future?
I think polling will be much more widespread than it is now, believe it or not, as widespread as it is. I think many communities will realize the utility of surveys, that they are a fast, efficient, and inexpensive way to get good, accurate information. So I think we'll see a lot more expansion locally. We'll see it more around the world, too. There'll be more international surveys. Global opinion will become commonplace, maybe with a television show within an hour collecting global opinion on a particular issue. Technically, we can do that now. In terms of technology, we can do that now.
And how has polling changed politics, and how would it change in the future, do you foresee?
Well, I think the good outweighs the bad, because I think it's leaders are to lead and not follow public opinion, and so there are some violations, of course, indeed. But a good leader will listen to public opinion and serve the public and follow it if they think in good conscience this is what they should do. But so I think the good far outweighs the bad in terms of enlightening leaders and in terms of giving the public a vote, really, because in a democracy, this is the goal, is to give people a chance to speak their mind at all times.
President Clinton is often accused of being excessively poll conscious and poll driven. How would you like to see polling used, as you said, properly? What would be a proper use of it on a given issue, for instance?
Well, I think it would behooves a leader to know all they can about where people stand on a given issue. The reasons they hold these opinions, what they know about it, the level of education and awareness, that's vital. But then they should exercise their own judgment and not put their conscience aside just to get votes and so forth. But I think a leader would be foolish not to pay public attention to public opinion, but they would be certainly wrong if they let that lead them instead of their leading public opinion.
George, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.